Evening, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mike Williams, and it is indeed a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. Tonight's session is entitled, Does Contempt Belong in Public Life? Our leader for this evening is Dr. Krista K. Thomason, Associate Professor of Philosophy, Swarthmore College, and also National Humanities Center Fellow 2021-2022. As we begin, as in times past, I want to acknowledge my team, the Education Department, who are, as I mentioned before, I'm Mike Williams, Interim Director of Education Programs, and I look forward to working with you all and learning from and in supporting and surrounding you all in the coming months. You always have a direct line to me. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. We also have Meredith Graham, who is our Interim Associate Director who oversees course development, select institutes and programming, and of course, Raven Ferguson, our education programs coordinator, who is our primary contact between scholars and the webinars. Raven works with scholars to prepare their PowerPoints, collect their readings, and share them with you all. And we're so appreciative of the work that she's doing behind the scenes for this series and for education programs as a whole. The National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina, and for 44 years, we have supported the best in humanities scholarship and humanities education. We're the only private nonprofit institution devoted exclusively to the study and the advancement of the humanities. Here at the center, our education programs serves as a nexus between our scholars and educators. Our goal is to consistently build those bridges between the scholarly world and everyday classroom, and we support educators at all levels, with a large majority being at the K-12 level. We do have collegiate and graduate levels educators as well. Please know that we also have a wealth of resources available from tonight's webinar and others in the Humanities in Class Digital Library. As members of the library, you have ready access to these materials and to the recording of this webinar once it is posted. You also have access to the Humanities in Class Digital Library Group Humanities in Class webinar series. The digital library houses resources from over 80 national and international humanities organizations, including scholarly institutions, research centers, archives, sites, and museums, among many others. And we would encourage you all to explore those curated collections that allow you to explore specific things found in the OER resources. And again, the webinars will have specific resources that you can use in your classroom practice, as you can see from the resources which are available. We'd also like to invite you all to check out some of our recent and upcoming webinars featuring past fellows, Vincent Brown, Juliana Barr, Mia Bay, and Maggie Chow. The sessions began in the fall and extend through May 4th, 2023. As you can see, they will be delving into a range of compelling topics that can be easily applied to your respective classrooms or instructional environments. Our online courses are currently accepting registrations for the second session of our Spring 2023 course series. These are 5 or 6 primarily asynchronous courses that will allow you to dig more deeply into different topics and to engage with the work that we're doing at the center. Our webinars like tonight will provide you 5 online professional development hours. However, our regular semester online courses offer 35 professional development hours. If you're interested in any of our offerings or have questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly at mwilliams@nationalhumanitiescenter.org. If you have a cohort or group, we can also work with you on group rates as well. And judging from the chat tonight, I see a number of familiar names of individuals who have been or are currently enrolled in our courses. So it's great to see you all, and we appreciate you all joining us. Thank you for taking the time out tonight to be with us. Tonight's featured course is Let's Talk, Using Humanities to Promote Civil Discourse in the Classroom, which is currently running, but we also have a session that will be running beginning March 20th. Again, during our second session. Let's Talk provides disciplinary approaches to promoting civil discourse in the pre-collegiate course or secondary classroom. Through this professional development course, teachers gain an understanding of the specific ways in which the humanities can open the conversation around civility and comedy. The training draws from examples in history, philosophy, art, literature, and politics. Teacher participants can create curricular connections and classroom activities that follow the same model. This course was originally designed with the support of the state of California as well. So please, if you're interested, feel free to sign up. And Sadinia, I see your message there regarding gaining a lot of resources from the courses you took last summer. We appreciate you joining us and being a part of that experience. I'm also pleased to announce our 2023 Teaching African American Studies Institute entitled Recentering the Narrative, Black Women's Voices of the 19th and 20th Century, which is scheduled for July 10th through 14th, 2023. This week-long institute, and I should say in-person institute, will explore the voices of Black women as they have documented, inspired, and reflected the Black experience in the 19th and 20th centuries. In this institute, travel expenses will be covered. Lodging will be covered, as well as a modest stipend will be provided to those who are accepted. Registration opened on January the 5th, 2023, and will remain open until February the 15th. So please navigate to our education programs page for more information. All of the work that I'm describing is informed by a strong and talented Teachers Advisory Council. We have a team of educators across the country who are giving us feedback and consult with us on various projects. We will begin accepting applications in the spring for the 2023-2024 Council. Keep an eye out for updates from the center via our direct emails and social media channels. We encourage you to apply if you're interested in being more actively involved in the work that we're doing. And again, thank you to our TAC members. They do a remarkable job. Tonight's webinar is audio and PowerPoint based. So you will not see our leader directly, but you'll be able to interact with both of us through the chat box. There are two primary chat boxes. One is the audience chat box where you can interact among each other, and the other is the speaker chat box for any questions that you may have for Dr. Thomason or I. I'll be monitoring those questions and bringing them to her attention throughout the presentation. Again, thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled, Does Contempt Belong in Public Life? With our leader, Krista K. Thomason, Associate Professor, Department of Philosophy, Swarthmore College, and National Humanities Center Fellow, 2021-2022. Krista K. Thomason is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Swarthmore College. She received her BA from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and her PhD from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. In 2021-2022, she was the Philip L. Quinn Fellow at the National Humanities Center. Her areas of expertise include philosophy of emotion, moral philosophy, history of philosophy, and political philosophy. Some of her publications appear in Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, European Journal of Philosophy, Kantian Review, and The Monist. She is the author of Naked, The Dark Side of Shame and Moral Life, and Dancing with the Devil, Why Bad Feelings Make Life Good, OUP, forthcoming. Without further ado, I present to you Dr. Krista K. Thomason. Krista, thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Can you guys hear me okay?
You're coming through loud and clear. Thank you.
All right. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much to all of you for being here, and thanks so much to Mike and to the National Humanities Center for the invitation. I had a wonderful time at during my cohort fellows with my cohort fellows at the National Humanities Center, and every day I think about wishing I could go back. So it was a really wonderful experience. So I am going to start off today. The work that I'm going to be talking about today is from the book that Mike mentioned. So this is my forthcoming book, which is called Dancing with the Devil: Why Bad Feelings Make Life Good. I was sort of hoping that at this point I would have a title to show you, or excuse me, not a title, the cover to show you, but I don't have that. So instead, what I've included here is just a couple of photos of prints that I had given my press that they may hopefully use as part of the cover. These are naturalist drawings from the 19th century naturalist Maria Sibyllin Marion, and she is really famous for these sort of intricate drawings where you have the beautiful plants, but then on top of the plants you have these different life cycles of bugs and insects and snakes. And I sort of love these because as somebody who works on negative emotions, one of the things that I like to talk about is sort of the way they're integrated into our lives. So I sort of like this, the beautiful bits with the ugly bits all mixed together. It's a nice symbol for the book. So stay tuned. That book should be out hopefully in October of this year. So before I get started, let me just tell you a little bit about how the talk's going to go, give you a kind of a preview. So I'm going to start with a story. It's a story about a sweatshirt. And then I'm going to move into a section where I kind of talk a little bit about what contempt is. This is a thing philosophers like to do. We like to define our terms. And then once we get that on the table, I'm going to talk a little bit about why should we worry about contempt? What's the problem with it? I'm going to draw on the lessons from the history of philosophy to try to explain what that's like. And then I'm going to go into the section that I call the blue skies of contempt, and that'll make sense when I actually get to the section of why it's called that. And then I'll end the talk with this big question, the question that's the title of my talk, which is, does contempt belong in public life? So that's just kind of a preview of how things are going to go. All right, so let's get started. Let me tell you a story. So this is a story about my sweatshirt. So this is not actually my sweatshirt. This is a picture that I took from the Swarthmore College bookstore website, but it is a faithful representation of my sweatshirt. My sweatshirt does indeed look like this. So for those of you who don't know anything about Swarthmore, we're in Pennsylvania, and we are about 10 miles or so outside of Philadelphia in the southwestern suburbs. Swarthmore is located in a county called Delaware County. And if you don't know much about my school, it's a small liberal arts college, and it has a reputation of being pretty left-leaning politically, but that is not true of the surrounding county where it exists. So in Delaware County, it's not particularly left-leaning. In fact, it's pretty conservative-leaning. So we have sometimes challenging relations between what we affectionately call town and gown. I'm pretty used to people finding out that I work at Swarthmore and having all kinds of interesting reactions to me because of that. So one day I was coming home from a long road trip, and I was wearing my Swarthmore sweatshirt, and I stopped in the grocery store to grab a couple of things, tired from being on the road. I get up to the cashier, and she kind of nods her head toward my sweatshirt and says, "Do you go there?" And I said, no, that happens to me a lot, actually. And I said, no, I teach there. And then she asked, well, what do you teach? And philosophers always dread that question because, you don't often meet a lot of philosophers in your life. And so we tend to have awkward conversations on airplanes and that sort of thing when people find out who we are. So I said, well, I teach philosophy. And I guess I wasn't quite ready for what happened next because what ended up happening was my cashier sort of launched into a bit of a diatribe about what is philosophy anyway. That's not really something you can study. Isn't it just everybody's opinions? What do you do with yourself all day? What do you write papers or something and just read books? Well, how's anybody supposed to learn anything about that? And I just I wish that I had snappy comebacks for any of that, but I did not in fact have any of those. I just sort of stammered awkwardly and tried to answer the questions as they came to me, and then she just sort of scoffed at me and kind of dismissed me and threw my groceries at me kind of relatively unceremoniously. So I'm going to try to convince you that this is a story about contempt, where I'm the object of my cashier's contempt. But maybe before I do that, I should probably tell you a little bit about what contempt is. So, like I mentioned, this is something that philosophers tend to do. We like to define our terms. And one of the things that particularly philosophers of emotion are interested in is, well, how do we distinguish emotions from each other? What's the difference between, like, let's say, contempt and anger, or contempt and jealousy, or something like that? Well, if you're trying to figure that out, then probably what you want to do is offer something, a provisional definition of contempt. My apologies for my very text-heavy slides here, but I wanted to make sure you have them in case you were having trouble sort of listening, following along just by listening to me talk. So here's a list of characteristics that I'm drawing on from the recent philosophy literature on contempt. These are defining characteristics of contempt. So this is a provisional definition. You can argue with me that maybe you don't like these characteristics, but I figured I'd put them out here and just to give you a sense of what philosophers tend to think contempt is. So one of the features contempt has is that it's globalist. So what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that contempt's focus is usually the whole person. When you say, I have contempt for you, we're usually referring to the whole person we have contempt for. Typically, what we don't say is, I have contempt for what you did. So we tend to focus on, contempt is sort of like a character judgment rather than a judgment about what somebody has done. It's also comparative. So built into feeling contempt is kind of measuring the object of contempt against either yourself or some standard being applied. And that goes really closely hand in hand with the next feature, which is that you find the person inferior. So when you feel contempt towards somebody, you usually think of them as low or lesser, maybe beneath you if you're comparing them to yourself, or beneath or low some relative to some standard being applied. So courage is a good example. Like, let's say you're trying to say, measure somebody and determine whether or not they're courageous. If they fall short of that, if you think that they're a coward, right, they're inferior to the standard that you're trying to apply. And then this last one, this one's a little bit more contentious. So we tend to, although it's not always the case, we tend to withdraw from the object of our contempt. That can look different in a lot of ways. You can be dismissive, you can be mocking, you can just sort of like scoff at somebody. Some philosophers refer to the "I'm done with you" feature of contempt, right? So sometimes when we have contempt for people, we just say, you know what, I'm done with you. I'm turning my back on you. I'm ending this conversation. So I think the interaction I had with my cashier is a story about contempt. So I think she displays contempt towards me. So I think it's got all of the elements that we just saw in the previous slide. It has this globalist element. I'm read as a type. That's actually something I hear quite a bit in the area that we're in. I'm one of those Swarthmore types, as they'll say. It has the comparative element. I think the standard that I'm being compared to is sort of the common sense, salt of the earth, kind of hardworking person. And when I'm judged by that standard, I come up short, right? I'm the useless head in the clouds intellectual. I don't do any real work, and I don't have any common sense. And so, and then we've got the withdrawal element, right? The sort of scoffing, the mockery, the unceremoniously kind of throwing my groceries at me. So you might wonder, why should we worry about contempt? But before I get to that section, let me go ahead and pause here and see if Mike has any questions for me.
At this point, I don't see any questions in the chat. I do have a practical question, though, about the cashier's diatribe. And the response is, this a general practice out in the community in and around Swarthmore? And then also the other question is had you been prepared for this encounter, how would you have responded to that contempt? Or
Oh, that's a great question, Mike. So I would say this is not normal. I mean, it's normal for me to get, like, maybe some snide comments here and there, like, oh, you're one of those. I get that comment quite but sort of like length of the diatribe was a little bit unusual and sort of shocking to me, I will say. I have definitely told this story to many people because it was a bit unusual. So funny you ask about how I would have responded. So I don't actually know how I would have responded. And in part, that's kind of going to be, as you'll see, that's going to be part of the story of contempt, is that As I'm going to, I think, kind of touch on later, I think one of the problems with contempt is that the person who's the object of contempt actually doesn't have a wide range of responses to make when you are the object of somebody's contempt. It's one of the things that makes it really difficult to actually be the object of someone's contempt is because it feels like there's no quite right way to respond.
Uh, Indeed, indeed. Sandinia, who's in the chat, mentions that I used to hold an entire political party in contempt, but I think I'm more open now. So thanks for
All
sharing that,
right.
Sandinia. But that's
Thank
that's
you.
yeah, that's all we have at this point. But thank you.
Okay. All right,
Okay.
great. Okay. All right, so we'll soldier forth then. So all right, so I've told you a little bit about what I think contempt is. Now let's ask the question. Well, why should we worry? I mean, why does it matter? Why does contempt pose any sort of a special problem? So here, what I'm going to do is draw on some lessons from the history of philosophy to do that. So before I do that, you might ask yourself, well, why? Why should we read dead people? So my students ask me this kind of question all of the time. Why aren't we just reading kind of the most cutting edge research in philosophy of emotion to understand all of this stuff? Like, why go back and read all of these dead people? So I figure what I might do is pause for a second and tell you a couple of reasons why I think it might be a good idea to do this. So as a historian of philosophy, this is something I do all of the time, and I think it's a valuable thing to do. So why is that? Well, let me start with number one. So those of you who are familiar with Ecclesiastes will be, you'll remember this line: "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." Right. So, as a historian of philosophy, I tend to think that Ecclesiastes is right about this. When you go back and you read people from long, long, long ago, you realize that a lot of the concerns that you have are also concerns that they had. Contempt is, a pressing contemporary question for us, but we are definitely not the first people to care about it. Since philosophers have written things down, they have been interested in questions about, which of our emotions are virtuous, which of them are vicious, how should we feel about our fellow citizens and all the people that we live around in our political life? How should we respond to ideas that are presented to us that we find offensive or maybe even dangerous? So these are all questions that are entertained by philosophers for years and years. So I'm of the view that I don't think we should go about reinventing the wheel absolutely every single time we have a philosophical question. Maybe it's a smart idea to figure out what other people have said about this thing and read their answers. Maybe their answers will give us a head start on some of our answers, or they will give us some insight into the problems that we have. So that's one reason I think it's good to read dead people. The other reason is I'm going to borrow a phrase from a 19th century philosopher who I adore, Anna Julia Cooper, called the charmed circle. So here's a question for you. So I'm so glad you guys played Stevie Wonder before the talk started, because Stevie Wonder's here on my slide. So what do Robert Burns, Shakespeare, Los Lobos, Stevie Wonder, and Oliver Stone all have in common? They all reference Ecclesiastes, what I said on the previous slide, in some portion of their work. So Anna Julia Cooper, 19th century philosopher who was actually born into and was then, after emancipation, was educated and wrote this wonderful book called A Voice from the South. In that book, she has an essay where she talks about the value of education, particularly the value of education for women, because, of course, that was a debated topic. Should women be educated? She says one of the values of being educated is that you get inducted into what she calls this charmed circle, or you get to be able to summon this charmed circle. So what does she mean by this charmed circle? So we think about reading old dead people as marshaling together an advisory council. So you end up with all of these resources that you can draw on to try to help you answer your own questions and make sense of your own experiences. So it's kind of like having a circle of friends that you can go to and talk with and commune with when you need them. But not only that, you're connected to these long dead authors from the past. You're also connected to all of the people who have read these same books. So now Stevie Wonder has something in common with Robert Burns as being both people who have read Ecclesiastes. And so you now have this thing that connects you not only to the distant past, but also to all of the human beings who have ever encountered this work. And your charmed circle can be a source of support for you, it can be a resource for you, but it can also challenge you and it can give you much needed perspective. So I think it's really valuable to read old dead people and to learn from them, and we end up with this kind of sense of community when we do that, when we engage with these works. So that's just a little bit of an aside about why bother doing this stuff. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to zero in on a particular portion of the history of philosophy, the 18th century, because they were particularly interested in contempt. Now, contempt has, of course, been a topic for a really long time, but I think the 18th century was a hot topic, and the 18th century philosophers were responding to their social and political worlds in exactly the same way that you and I are responding to our social and political worlds. So I'm going to have to apologize ahead of time to the history teachers out there, because I'm going to give like the quickest and most simplistic gloss of what's going on in the social and political world in England and France in the 18th century. So just this is like the quickest snapshot. So philosophers in England at the time, of course, were coming out on the other side of the English Civil War. And one of the things that was really weighing on their minds were questions about religious and political factions, and in particular, tolerance for dangerous ideas. So they were really grappling with the question, what happens when there's someone in your social and political world who expresses an idea, not just that you think is wrong, but that you think is dangerous? How do you handle that? What do you do about that? And then from France, we have sort of responses from the philosophers working in this time period, responses to sort of the age of absolutism. And in particular, they were pretty concerned with class politics, and they were concerned with sort of the wealthy being able to use a state power for their control. And so because they were really interested in relationships between poor and rich, this is where kind of a lot of their interest in contempt comes from. So what I'm going to do is give you some possibilities for some philosophical teams that perhaps you are interested in joining when it comes to contempt. These are just representatives. So Rousseau's going to represent one team. He's not the only person that has this view, but he's going to represent this team. So Rousseau's going to represent team contempt is bad. So Rousseau has these arguments against contempt. He thinks of it as a kind of a vain form of self-love. And so I already apologized to the history teachers. Now I'm going to apologize to the French teachers, because I'm going to pronounce amour propre particularly very wrong, because I do not, my French is very poor. So this vain form of self-love that Rousseau identifies, it involves for him a concern about your social position or your rank. So a lot of it's about like a love of honor and reputation. It's the thing that pushes you to keep up with the Joneses, that sort of attitude. Well, Rousseau thinks being obsessed with, status or rank actually prevents us from being fully in sympathy with our fellow human beings. So look, if you always see somebody else, your neighbors, as a person who's in competition with you, then you're not really going to see them as a fellow. It's going to prevent you from having that attitude toward them. So Rousseau ends up concluding that contempt is a passion we ought to avoid. It's part of this, ugly part of human psychology, where all we're concerned with is sort of social position. Now, if that team doesn't sound terribly attractive to you, perhaps Team Wollstonecraft sounds more attractive. So Mary Wollstonecraft, she's Rousseau's contemporary, she's from England. She's not so pessimistic about contempt. So yeah, it can be dangerous, but contempt has a place. We just have to be really careful with it and use it in the right way. Probably the best evidence for this is Mary Wollstonecraft's famous exchange with Edmund Burke, who's another philosopher, lives at the time. He writes an essay about the revolution in France, and it is by Mary Wollstonecraft's lights, an ugly essay that is full of contempt. So she writes an essay in response, A Vindication of the Rights of Men, which is kind of a companion piece to her perhaps more famous A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which I like to describe as a masterclass in low blows, because she just eviscerates Burke with all kinds of terrible insults, and her essay just absolutely dripping with contempt. And the way she sort of seems to imagine it is she's justified in responding to Burke with contempt because he dealt out the contempt first. And so, because he made, by her lights, a ridiculous fool of himself in writing this terrible essay that's dripping with contempt, because he stooped low first, then it's perfectly fine for her to stoop low in return. As a matter of fact, it would be worse if she responded to him with some kind of careful and serious counterargument, because that would be dignifying what is ultimately an undignified essay. So, there are a couple of options for you while you start thinking about where you fall on the scale of is contempt okay. What I want to do is highlight what are some of the questions we inherit from our dead friends here. So there are lots of questions we can ask. The ones I'm going to pull out are, I think, the natural ones we might be asking ourselves. Are we justified in feeling? Are we expressing contempt? Who, if there's anyone, deserves contempt? What are the risks and consequences of expressions of contempt? And how does contempt affect civil discourse? So I'm mainly going to be focusing on these last two. I'm going to be thinking mostly about kind of expressions of contempt, and I'm going to be mostly thinking about them as they take place kind of in public life and in civil discourse. I'm perfectly happy to talk about some of the other ones if we have time, but I'm mainly going to focus on these questions. Okay, so let me stop there and see if Mike's got anything for me now.
Yeah, the participants are really active in the chat. I don't have any questions right now, but I have some interesting observations as well. As far as Michael, who said earlier, it's not just philosophy. I've noticed a lot of contempt for liberal arts and humanities in general lately. I think it's tied to the tendency to view. I think it's tied to the tendency to view college as solely as a career training ground as well. Rachel mentioned that the charm circle is a cool way to connect the past. It's fascinating to see how life has changed since that writing, yet how much principally still applies. And so I found that fascinating as well. And I am also interested in maybe exploring in a later time through your readings, but interested in how Wollstonecraft's approach can be effectively applied today. I think I'm leaning more toward her than Team Rousseau, and very much interested in hearing more about that approach, but how that can be effectively applied, particularly today, understanding that contempt has a place, but we have to be careful with it. That is
definitely
very fascinating.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Yeah, absolutely. We'll see. Let's see if we can get back to that.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, great. All right. So let's do a little bit more history of philosophy. So I'm gonna. This is the title of the section of my talk called the Blue Skies of Contempt. So where does that come from? Well, it comes from my good friend W.E.B. Du Bois. So although I really love Team Wollstonecraft and I really love Team Rousseau, and I think they both make excellent points, I'm really much more aligned, I think, myself with Team Du Bois. So, of course, this is W.E.B. Du Bois, 19th century and early 20th century philosopher. You probably know him more, or perhaps you know him better as a sociologist, and that's fair because he indeed was a sociologist. But I like to tease my sociologist friends and tell them that really deep down, he's a philosopher, because that's what he actually wanted to do when he was an undergraduate. He took philosophy classes actually with the president of undergraduate college and totally fell with it. And when he went to Harvard, he was planning on studying philosophy, and he met William James, who's another philosopher who was there at Harvard, who became his mentor and his friend. And he told William James he was going to study philosophy, and William James said, "Ooh, I don't know. I don't think you're going to make any money being a philosopher." And so Du Bois thought about it and thought, financial stability is kind of important to me, so I guess I won't do philosophy. So he ended up taking another path, but it was his first love, and so I claim him certainly as a philosopher. So the phrase "blue skies" comes from one of the readings that I sent along. So, of course, Du Bois's famous work is "The Souls of Black Folk," one of his famous works. And in the first essay of that book, which is the Of Our Spiritual Strivings essay, he describes the appearance of what he calls the veil. So the veil is this really, really rich and layered metaphor for his experience of racial prejudice in America. And in that essay, he talks about the exchange he has on the playground with a classmate. So he says that, they were all on the playground one day at school and they were exchanging visiting cards, which are like business cards, except they're for individuals. And apparently, if you're an elementary school kid in the 19th century, this is fun for you to do this. And so he offers his visiting card to his one of his white classmates, and it's rejected out of hand. And he comes to realize that it's rejected because of racial animus. So, how does he respond to this? Here's how he describes his reaction. He says, I had thereafter no desire to tear down that veil, to creep through. I held all beyond it in common contempt, and lived above it in a region of blue sky and great wandering shadows. That sky was bluest when I could beat my mates at examination time, or beat them at a foot race, or even beat their stringy heads. So, what I love about Du Bois' metaphor here is I think it captures something really central to contempt. Contempt has within it a kind of self-assuredness. The way I like to put it is it's I'm not like that. So if you feel contempt for someone, it's usually because you're thinking to yourself, whatever they're doing or whatever they're like, you're not like that. Now, Du Bois uses this as a way of sort of protecting his self esteem from this racial prejudice that he experiences. And he does that throughout his life. So he convinces himself that when the white world responds to him with a kind of contempt, he responds to them in contempt in return by thinking, well, the reason you don't like me is because I'm too good for you. And so the way he puts it in some of his later works, he says things like, I almost pitied my pale companions who were not of the Lord's anointed, and who saw in their dreams no splendid quests for golden fleeces. Or say things like, they were the losers who did ardently court me, and not I, which seemed to be proven by the fact that I had no difficulty outdoing them in nearly all competitions. So the more evidence that he marshals that he is able to outdo all of his white classmates in all these various ways, the bluer his sky becomes, the more self-assured he is, and the more his contempt is fed, right? This kind of counter-contempt, what we might call, what sometimes philosophers call in literature, this counter-contempt. When somebody shows you contempt, you show them in return. It helps him kind of protect his sense of self-worth. Now, the problem is Du Bois' views about his contempt are actually kind of complicated. So he talks about the blue sky, but then he also seems to think that whatever his contempt is doing, it's ultimately just a kind of illusion. So even on that same page where he talks about his blue sky, he says, alas, with the years, all this fine contempt began to fade. For the worlds I longed for and their dazzling communities were theirs and not mine. He contrasts himself, as he puts it, to other black boys who, quote, shrunk into silent hatred for the pale world about them and a mocking distrust of everything white. He talks about trying to keep up this same sort of attitude, this, keep his sky blue when he goes to Harvard. And so he kind of intentionally withdraws from social life, and he describes himself during those times as conceited enough still to imagine, as in high school, that they who did not know me were the losers and not I. But then again, later in his other writings, he says he admits that ultimately that was really driven by a fear of rejection. He says, I was desperately afraid of not being wanted, of appearing to desire the company of those who had no desire for me. So you might expect, given how Du Bois starts, that he would be on Team Wollstonecraft, right? So what kind of contempt is justified if not that kind of contempt, the kind of contempt that you would feel in response to racial prejudice that's directed at you first? And yet, that actually doesn't seem to be what Du Bois thinks. So as he has this complicated kind of a vision of his contempt. I think probably the best encapsulation of this really comes when you're looking at Darkwater, one of his later books. He has an essay in Darkwater that I think illustrates what I call the tragedy of contempt in public life. So in that book, there's an essay called The Souls of White Folk. And that essay is, I think, and other scholars have argued this too, it's a kind of companion piece to the Of Our Spiritual Strivings essay from The Souls of Black Folk, where he talks about the blue sky. So in Of Our Spiritual Strivings, he talks very poignantly and very, intimately about what it's like be the object of contempt, of racial contempt. Well, in the souls of white folk, the tables get turned, and he talks about white people as the object of his contempt. And so the way he describes that is he kind of starts off with this image of himself in this high tower, he says, above the seas. And from his high tower, he can see everything. And in the things he can see, one of the things he can see is white people. He can see their very souls. He can see through them. He describes them as being able to see through their clothes and even into their entrails. And he talks about basically how ridiculous they are. They're ridiculous because they continue to hold on to this really delusional fantasy of white supremacy, that just because they're white, they're better than everybody else. And Du Bois describes that as kind of laughable. So it itself, white supremacy, is the object of his contempt. So the way he describes being able to see through this is they preach and strut and shout and threaten, crouching as they clutch at rags of facts and fancies to hide their nakedness. So even though it's transparent, completely transparent to him, that white supremacy is just a farce, it doesn't matter. They try their best to kind of like keep up this ridiculous farce. And that, for Du Bois, is an object of contempt. It's pitiable and silly in some ways. And unfortunately, as the essay goes on, Du Bois says, look, when white people sort of feel this delusion threatened, frequently what they do is respond to that with a kind of anger and destruction and violence. So they'll literally go to any lengths to kind of keep up this delusion, to keep up this fantasy. And so what should we do about that? You might think, well, isn't more contempt sort of justified in a response? But again, Du Bois actually doesn't quite seem to end there. That's not really what he says. He says, instead of contempt, he says, there surges in me a vast pity for people imprisoned and enthralled, hampered and made miserable for such a cause, such a fantasy, right? The fantasy of white supremacy. He ends the essay with this kind of like really hopeful tone where he says, I will not believe that this is all that must be, that all the shameful drama of the past must be done again today before sunlight sweeps the silver seas. So what do we do with all this? I think there's a couple of lessons that we take away from Du Bois. And I think one of them is, and I'll come back to this in a minute, one of them is in public life, we tend to do what I'm going to call this building of images. So the way that Du Bois talks about it in Darkwater is this. He says, we do not really associate with each other. We associate with our ideas of each other, and few people have either the ability or the courage to question their own ideas. And I think that thought motivated Du Bois for his whole career. So he spent his whole life trying through a huge variety of methods, both in his fiction, in his nonfiction, in his the sociological work that he did. Most of what he did was kind of aiming at trying to get people to question their ideas, particularly of Black Americans, but the visions, also the visions that white people sort of build of themselves and of each other. So the thing is, and I think this is why Du Bois is a little bit skeptical about contempt, contempt really feeds into this image building thing that we do. It is particularly prone to that. And you can see exactly why, given the particular characteristics that it has. So when you feel contempt for someone, you sort of read them as a type, right, rather than as an individual. I'm one of those Swarthmore types to my cashier. You see them as inferior, right? So you're beneath me, and that causes you to withdraw from them. You're not really worth my time. I think it's actually hard for us to avoid building images of people and ourselves. So I don't want to be too pessimistic about that. I think, we all come to some conclusions and judgments about who we think we are, and we sort of imagine ourselves in certain ways and build a certain conception of ourselves. And we also do that with other people. Look, we can only make conclusions about mostly what people show us. And sometimes, look, if people show us certain things, we're going to draw certain conclusions from that. If that's how you act, then I guess that's who you are. The trick, though, is to remember that those images, both the ones we make of ourselves and the ones we make of other people, those things should probably be open to revision. Because, we don't always get it right. I mean, sometimes we walk around thinking that we are a certain way, and in fact, we're not that way. So we got to be open to the idea that maybe we're wrong, and maybe we rush to judgment either about ourselves or somebody else. trouble is contempt makes that revision pretty difficult because it does this thing of sort of slotting people into types, and because it does this thing of sort of saying you're beneath me and you're not worth my time. I think we're a little bit less likely to kind of go back and revise and think anew about the judgments that we made about other people. So for my money, I think this is what Du Bois is really getting at when he's kind of a little bit concerned about contempt and how it actually works. I think he's a little skeptical that maybe what we're doing is using contempt kind of has this way of kind of reinforcing the images that we build rather than breaking them down. So let me pause before we get to the big question.
Well, that's great, and I will say that Du Bois exists as one of my friends in my charm circle.
Yay!
So I found it very enlightening, your discussion of the living above the region of blue skies. I did. I found that very, very enlightening. And I'm also wondering, have you had the opportunity to, I guess, really delve into the relationship between the idea of double consciousness and his ideas as far as the contempt, ideas of contempt, making him feel better about himself when racism threatens his self-worth, and how that kind of lines up with those ideas of double consciousness as well.
Yeah,
I can see the relationship between the two.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I find his discussion of double consciousness is so rich, and it is it's one of those things where there's so many different sources that are part of his discussion that are like buried in there that actually people I think are not totally visible. So he has we knew he was familiar with like George Eliot talks about double consciousness actually in some of her work, and so does like Emerson and Thoreau have the same sort of thing. So there was this like little cluster of people, and there was even a sort of like a psychological discussion of this from kind of the early days of psychology that William James was familiar with. So but double consciousness actually means something a little different in all of those arenas, and it doesn't seem to be exactly what Du Bois thinks. So like Du Bois seems to be using it in this really interesting, he puts kind of a twist on it. But then, and I think people sort of read it in I think people are pretty prone to reading it kind of like in one way and saying, well, like what he actually means is this kind of, the measuring, as he puts it, like measuring your soul by the tape of the world, right? So you're having to kind of both only given this one tool, somebody else's tool, a tool that is in fact telling you that you're inferior, and then you have to use that thing to kind of measure your own soul, while at the same time kind of knowing that it's inferior and knowing that it's painting you in a way that you don't agree with. But then there's also this kind of the way he describes it. There's this idea of sort of the way Thoreau and George Eliot talk about it. They talk about double consciousness as that voice in your head that's telling you should be experiencing something some way. So like Eliot talks about it as, being like you're in Paris or you're in Rome or something, and like somewhere in your head you're supposed to be experiencing the sights you're seeing in some way, but there's also this other part of you that's kind of monitoring and making sure you're experiencing it that way, even though you may not be. So there's this weird two-ness inside of your head. But even then, Du Bois doesn't really talk about it in quite that way. He sort of talks about it both in the measuring tape way, but then also as kind of wanting to be yourself and who you authentically are, but then also wanting to be sort of welcomed in the world that's around you, and knowing that you kind of can't do both of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is that it?
Yes, that's it for now. I'll continue to monitor.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Okay. All right. So let's get to the biggie, the big question: whether or not contempt belongs in public life. Like I got to pay off, right? I got to deliver. So Here's one of those annoying philosophy things again. So I said I'm going to talk to you about contempt. I better tell you what contempt is. Well, if I'm going to talk about contempt in public life, I better tell you what public life is. Well, that's a big topic. You could define public life in all sorts of different ways. It can mean a lot of different things. What I'm going to do is draw on a part of public life that I think is helpful in illuminating all that stuff that I just did from Du Bois, because it comes from Jane Addams, who is Du Bois's contemporary. So Du Bois and Jane Addams were in this group of philosophers from the U.S. called the American Pragmatists. So for those of you who know John Dewey, of course, John Dewey is always the guy who people think of when they think of the American Pragmatists. But Addams was one, Du Bois was one, William James, Du Bois's mentor, was also one. So they have a really robust discussion of what sometimes gets called the practice of democracy. So when the pragmatists talk about democracy, they're not thinking about democracy just as a form of government. So they're not just thinking about voting. They're not just thinking about senators and things like that. They're thinking of democracy as a kind of commitment that you make, a commitment to live a certain way, a way of life, democratic. So from Jane Addams' work, I'm going to draw a couple of features of the practice of democracy. So one of the things she thinks is core to it is understanding all the needs of your fellow citizens and trying to understand their experience. You have to see your lot in life as connected with the lots of others. The way Addams sometimes puts it is our boat goes forward together and our boat goes backward together. You have to collaborate and cooperate and figure out how to do that despite your many differences with the people who are in your social world. So for those of you who don't know much about Addams, she lived this. She is known for her philosophical work, but she's also known for her peace work, and for her work on social justice. So Addams opens Hull House in 1889, which is a social settlement and a kind of charitable institution, and it's designed to help the local residents of the place where she opens it. So the area where it was in Chicago. That area was primarily inhabited by many poor immigrant families. So what made Hull House unique was that it was an in-residence social settlement, which meant all of the charitable workers, the people who wanted to work at Hull House and help the community, they all had to live in Hull House. So it was not a kind of, drop in, do good, and then pull back out. It was no. If you're going to actually be a part of this, you have to commit here and you have to live here. And Addams herself lived in Hull House too. So a lot of the work that she does, her philosophical work, is deeply informed by this experience, by actually being, living around the people that she's trying to help. And a lot of it is about this really, fascinating kind of experience of, having a certain view about what you think you're going to do to help people, and then learning once you actually live among them that, as a matter of fact, the things you thought are not necessarily what they need. Very much like Du Bois, she spent a lot of time trying to get other people who had contempt for poor immigrants to try to understand them better. And so the way she puts it in her famous book, Democracy and Social Ethics, she says, for much of the insensibility and hardness of the world is due to the lack of imagination, which prevents a realization of the experiences of other people. And the essay that I sent on her essay, The Devil Baby of Chicago, is, I think, a great illustration of exactly the kind of practice that she's interested in. This kind of, trying to show people and open people's eyes to other people's experiences. So what happens, of course, is there are rumors that a devil child is born in Chicago. The rumors claim that it's reported on the Chicago Examiner. The rumors claim that the devil baby has been taken to Hull House to be, protected or something. So Jane Addams and her staff end up spending an inordinate amount of time fielding all of these questions about the devil baby. So people come knock on the door and they say, "Where's the devil baby? We demand to see the devil baby. Can you show him to me? I'll pay you money. I swear. Just tell me where he is." And of course, Jane Addams and her staff are like, "There is no devil baby. What's wrong with you?" So her essay kind of opens with this mocking kind of tone where she's making jokes about all the calls they have to answer and all the people who are coming. And she's sort of like playing a kind of, it's we're on the inside with her readers and saying, well, you and I know there's no such thing as the devil baby, and isn't this all silly? All these people who believe in this thing. Now, the thing is, Adams knows that many of her readers are going to be upper class Chicagoans. Many of them are going to harbor anti-immigrant prejudice. So she kind of starts off with, I think, the attitude she thinks they are going to have. They're going to use the fervor over the devil baby to just reinforce all of their prejudices about poor immigrants. Oh, they're just full of superstition and blah, 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 that sort of thing. Well, then as the essay goes on, Adams changes her tone, and she starts relaying the stories of the poor immigrant women who are talking to her about the devil baby. Suddenly, she notices that women who otherwise were not particularly talkative, they start opening up to her, and they start telling her more intimate details about their lives. And as she listens to them, she starts to realize that, as a matter of fact, maybe the interest in the devil baby is not really about the devil baby at all. Maybe it's about what the devil baby represents. And so what she realizes is that many of the women in the community see a kind of kindred spirit in the poor woman who had the devil baby, the mother of the devil baby. And they think, here's a poor woman who, through no fault of her own, ends up cursed in this way with this devil child. What they see in her is someone whose life is out of control. And they see someone who's kind of like them. So here they are, having traveled from Europe to a country where they don't speak the language, where they don't have many opportunities, where they don't have jobs, where they're trying desperately to take care of their families. They don't know how to navigate any kind of system. They have no resources. And they themselves feel out of control in their own lives. And so she realizes that their interest in the devil baby is really about that. And she ends with the essay with kind of, inviting her readers to, I think, ponder this question, which is that, look, if your life circumstances were like theirs, if your life circumstances were radically beyond your control, what kind of things would you be willing to leave? Can you be so sure that you wouldn't have the same kind of interest in the devil baby that they do? So this is an exercise in kind of overcoming your contempt towards someone else in your social life, someone who you ultimately have a kind of prejudice against and who you don't understand, by trying to break down the images that you have of them. And Adams's essay is kind of an illustration of exactly how that looks. Okay, but since we're doing philosophy, philosophers always like to come up with objections to each other. So Team Wollstonecraft is definitely going to raise some flags and say, look, you're talking about all this skepticism about contempt, but is really contempt so bad? Sometimes contempt can be a good thing. What about when it's justified? What about when it's appropriate? Isn't it justified or appropriate? I think the worry that Adams and Du Bois have is this question of, well, how do we determine who deserves it, particularly when we're talking about public life? So Du Bois was perfectly familiar with the idea that there were plenty of white people who thought that Black Americans deserved contempt. Now, he, of course, thought they were wrong, but they thought that contempt was appropriate. Adams the same way. Plenty of her upper-class Chicagoans definitely thought that their contempt toward the immigrants in the community was deserved. It was appropriate contempt. I'm fairly certain that my cashier thinks that egghead liberal intellectuals like me deserve contempt, that their contempt toward me is appropriate. So here's the problem. The way I like to describe this is contempt isn't a forklift. You don't have to have a license to use it. It's a human attitude. And so everybody is going to feel it kind of in the way that they do. So it's not a thing that's reserved only for experts. So if that's the case, well, then how do we together determine who deserves contempt and when it's appropriate? So let's dig into that question a little bit more. So Team Wollstonecraft, I think, might say, well, look, what kind of contempt is deserved? Well, bad people deserve contempt. Well, that's going to rule out contempt that's based on prejudice, contempt that's just based on ignorance, or whatever. Again, though, I think Du Bois and Adams are going to say, but we're talking about contempt as it plays out in public life, inside the commitment to democracy. And so Adams is going to say, well, if that's right, then that means we have to collectively and collaboratively determine who the bad guys are. So this is going to start to make me a little nervous, especially if we're in Delaware County. Why would I say that? Well, is it just the folks of Delaware County who get to determine themselves who the bad guys are? Maybe, because if that happens, I'm going to be on that list. I'm almost positive, right? I'm going to be on the list of bad guys. And if that turns out to be true, what I want to know is, do I get a chance to defend myself? Does expressing contempt for me allow me to do that? And I don't know. So I think the thing about contempt that Rousseau and Du Bois and Adams get right is that we're probably better off without it, particularly in public life. If we're really supposed to be committed to democracy and breaking down our images of other people so that we can understand their experiences, I think contempt is going to be a roadblock to that, especially if it's sort of widespread. I think, unfortunately, that includes people who we see as unlikable. What we have to remember, though, is that who gets labeled likable and unlikable really varies depending on your time period. It depends on your majority-minority mix. It depends on the social circle you're in. And as much as sometimes I wish this were true, it's not. Being likable is not a precondition for participating in the practice of democracy. Again, as Adams is going to say, your boat goes forward together, your boat goes backward together. We're all in the same lot, whether we like it or not. Now, you might ask yourself, though, okay, well, we're talking about all of this stuff inside the practice of democracy, but what about people who don't want to practice democracy? Aren't there people like that? Not everybody is on board with the idea that we should be, committed to this kind of way of life. What about people who aren't? Should we have contempt for them because they sort of, they reject the practice of democracy altogether? So luckily, Du Bois is going to come through for me because he asks this very question, I think, in his 1926 essay, which is called The Shape of Fear, and it's about the Ku Klux Klan. So as we know, in the 20s in America, the Ku Klux Klan was really on the rise. As Du Bois points out, you think it's just in the South, but that is not true. In the 20s, the Klan was everywhere. It was in Ohio, it was in New Jersey, it was in Indiana, it was everywhere. And it only seemed to be gaining in numbers. And at the beginning of the essay, Du Bois points out that most people are responding to the rise of the Klan with contempt. They're sort of laughing at the Klan as he describes them. They mock them as parading around in, as he puts it, sheets and pillowcases. Oh, it's ha ha ha. It's so funny. Look at those people with the sheets and pillowcases on their heads in the woods. That's how people are sort of mostly responding to them, thinking, look, we're the normal ones, and we don't have to worry about those crazies in the woods. But throughout the essay, Du Bois points out all that mockery hasn't done a thing to get rid of the Klan. Klan is on the rise. So his question seems to be, what do we care about most? Do we care about getting rid of the Klan? Because if we do, it's not clear that contempt is the right attitude to have toward them. So the question I think we have to ask ourselves is whether or not having or expressing contempt toward a dangerous group, does it make them any less dangerous? And I confess I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's the question we got to ask. So when I teach about this stuff, my students always get exasperated with me when I express a lot of skepticism about contempt in public life, and they usually end with this question: when can I walk away? So what I mean by that is, when can I be done with somebody? I'm committed to the practice of democracy, and I'm supposed to be understanding my fellow citizens, but look, at a certain point, don't I get to walk away? And I'm not going to say no, but what I am going to say is, I want you to also, if you ask that question, I want you to ask a different question. I want you to ask the question, I'm the one who's the object of contempt. What would I want? So that's why I started out with the story about the sweatshirt, because where I'm coming from with all this theorizing is the question of, what's it like to be the object of contempt? You're on the receiving end of contempt. And how does that change the answer to the question? If you're asking, when can I walk away? How does it change how you think about this if you're the one feeling contempt or you're the one receiving contempt? And I think we might learn more if we think of ourselves as the ones who are receiving contempt. So I'm going to leave the last word to Robert Burns, one of our Charm Circle of Ecclesiastes, where he references Ecclesiastes in this poem, the address to the unco-good or the rigidly righteous. And I am absolutely not going to make a fool of myself in trying to do the accent, and I will not debase the beautiful poetry of Robert Burns by trying to do that. So I'm just going to read it straight. So he says, "Ye high exalted virtuous aims, tied up in godly laces, before you give poor frailty names, suppose a change of cases." So let me end there and say thank you, and say thank you to the wonderful folks at the National Humanities Center for this invitation. I'm so happy to be here. Twitter is a terrible horror show, but we talk about contempt. But I'm still on it for reasons I can't actually articulate or identify. But if you're on Twitter, you can please feel free to follow me at KK Thomason. You're more than welcome to email me. There's my Swarthmore email address, and I really appreciate all of you for being here, taking the time out of your evening to listen to me talk today. So thank you.
Good deal, and thank you so much. We really appreciate you, Dr. Thomason. We had one question and maybe a few others. I'm going to scroll through the chat. Claudia's question is, does contempt originate, does it always originate in bias, or I hope I read that correctly. Does contempt originate as a product of our biases?
That's a good question. So I think there's probably lots of philosophers who would say no, and I mean I think I tend to agree, because I think we can feel contempt for people for a lot of reasons. So you could imagine feeling contempt for someone. So one of the famous cases that's in the literature comes from a film, actually a French film called Contempt, where there's a husband and wife in the film. I won't give away very much, but the husband acts in such a way that's pretty, it's very self-serving and opportunistic, and he acts in ways that are pretty disrespectful to his wife. And so you can see her attitude of contempt start to creep in as the film goes on. The more she realizes the way he's behaving, he's sort of behaving in this really smarmy kind of, opportunistic way. And that is an object of contempt. That's an object of contempt. And I think that doesn't seem to be a case where people are responding. That doesn't seem to be a case where your bias, where contempt is coming out from bias. It seems to be more a case where you're just judging this person as really, acting really low and stooping to lows that you think are really terrible. So that doesn't seem to be just a prejudiced version of contempt. But you might still be, building a certain kind of image of a person. Now, images can be more and less accurate, and maybe that one's pretty accurate, but it doesn't seem like it's coming from mere bias, we might say, or mere prejudice.
Good deal. Thank you. I have one more question for you before we finish up.
Yeah.
This question that came up was regarding social media and whether likes and followers drive the collective determination of who the bad guys are on social media.
Yeah, that is definitely, I think that's definitely a thing that happens. We tend to, especially when we get into the justified contempt. One of the issues you might think that's happening with justified contempt is that, particularly with social media is a lot of kudos, right? And so you might think, you might say something bad about someone and you get lots and lots of likes, and you might think, like, yes, that's right, I am doing exactly the right thing. So not only can I tell myself a story about, when everybody gets sort of piled on, I think there's a lot of pressure to join the pile on and to contribute to that. And a lot of what we're doing is kind of responding, especially on social media, we're responding to such a tiny little bit of information about a person. And so what we end up doing is kind of like building this whole story about who we think this person is based on this tiny amount of information. And some of how we build that story is by, appealing to the other kinds of things that other people say it, or other people liked what I said, or somebody else is, quote tweeting this person. And so, we're all right together. I think we have a sense of, feeding on each other's overconfidence in our own judgments.
Great response. Thank you so much for that. And as I'm scrolling through the chat, I see a collective group of thank yous and great
Oh,
discussion. And
thank you. Thanks you. Thanks
everyone is
everybody.
so appreciative and thankful for having you here tonight. It was very much a grounded, relatable, and we're all thinking as we walk away from here. For example,
Excellent.
yeah, Tony mentions that it definitely makes me think about my own contemptuous beliefs. So
Good.
again, thank you,
I'm
Dr.
glad. That's exactly what I'm hoping.
That's what you're hoping for. But thank you, Dr. Thomason, for joining us, leading us, as well as sharing your expertise with us all. We have
Absolutely.
truly enjoyed this experience,
Thank
guiding
you
us through
so
an
much.
examination, guiding us through an examination of contempt and the history of philosophy, and how this informs how we evaluate contempt and our own contempt today. So, moving ahead, I'd encourage you all to keep up with all that's happening at the National Humanities Center via our various social media feeds to get updates on our activities. And again, our Twitter feed has temporarily been suspended, but you can feel free to check us out and follow us on social media, all other social media outlets, including Mastodon, Instagram, as well as Facebook, LinkedIn, and others as well. I'd invite you all to check us out on Thursday, January the 26th, 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 1968, Soul Music and the Year of Black Power with Mark Anthony Neal, the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke University. Again, thank you for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again during our Humanities in Class webinar series. You have all been awesome. I look forward to seeing you all in the chat again real soon. Again, if I can ever answer any questions for you, feel free to reach out to me directly. We appreciate you all. Have a great day and an awesome week.